Hello, I am back again with another video so soon. Who would have thought it, hey? Who is she? Who is she becoming? Anyway, I'm back with another video. And this video I think is more of like a challenge for myself. When I was thinking about sort of the books that I wanted to talk about, that I've been reading recently and stuff, there were kind of a lot of books that I knew that I didn't want to talk about. Part of the biggest reason I didn't want to talk about them is because I didn't really enjoy them. On my channel, I think there are very few negative reviews of books. I personally don't enjoy reviewing books negatively unless it's like something that I have already said to like a publicist that I would review and I didn't really enjoy it, and then I kind of try to create a very constructive review. When I don't like a book, I kind of just want to be done with it. But I have read quite a lot of books so far this year that have been quite disappointing. And then I was thinking that maybe actually it is worth talking about. I think it's a good exercise in kind of figuring out why you don't like books, and taking time to remove your kind of subjective feeling towards those books and create a dialogue that is objective. It's impossible to be objective in this situation, but to create a dialogue in which constructively discusses why the book wasn't good for you and your reading tastes. I think that exercise is also great to use in lots of different contexts. It just helps to aid critical thinking and stuff. I wanted to challenge myself because I wanted to do it and be as objective as possible. But objective in a very subjective sense. It's these aren't objective at all. So I've got 3 books today that I want to talk about, like my experience with them, why I didn't enjoy them. And since it's sort of like 3 reviews in one video, I've decided that I just want to focus on one specific point about each book and kind of review that book in the context of that specific point and why I didn't like it, but then also what I can learn from it in regards to writing, and what I think other people might be able to learn from it in regards to writing. So I think that kind of gives you the idea of what this video is going to be about. So let's just get into it and start it with the first book. And this is the book that doesn't have as great reviews as the other 2 do. So which demonstrates to me that perhaps I'm not perhaps the only one in feeling this feeling. So that book is Oval by Elvia Wilk. Elvia Wilk is a German-American author. I think this is her debut novel as far as I'm aware, but she has been writing previously, mostly journalism, I believe. This book is speculative, sci-fi, kind of set in the not-so-distant future in Berlin. Characters are dealing with the housing crisis, which we're all dealing with across the world, and there's a development of a pill called Oval, which triggers something in the brain and makes people more charitable. So that's kind of like the general premise of the book. At least that's kind of what it sells it as. Now, the thing that I didn't like the most about this book is more, I guess, the structure of the book. It has a very weak structure or no structure at all. My biggest issue is that for, I would say, the first 3/4 of the novel, I would pick it up, read a little bit, and feel completely aimless. There was nothing for me as a reader to anchor onto the point where I had to keep on looking back and rereading the synopsis to get a grip of what this book was supposed to be about, what this book was supposed to be telling me, and why I was reading this book. This book tried to tackle too many things all at once and ultimately ended up tackling nothing. And it was just directionless. I think the author had an idea and didn't quite know how to structure that idea best. And I feel like that's the point where a good editor will step in and help to, reconstruct that sort of narrative. And perhaps this didn't get that same treatment. The structure of the book creates a very slow and stagnant narrative in which the reader kind of can get very easily lost because there's nothing to connect to. There are some points which you think are key plot points which aren't actually dealt with at all. There are other key plot points, such as the entire premise of the book, which doesn't happen until the final quarter of the book. So you're kind of thinking, why is this the premise of the book? Why is this the title of the book? how did the book get to be about this thing that doesn't actually happen until the very end and then it's kind of just like rushed over? It feels more like it's a treatise on a very specific mindset that the author wants to portray. So therefore, rather than structuring it as a novel that propels the reader through, it's more just like vignettes of characters proposing the author's opinion in ways that don't make sense or ways that don't feel natural at all. So when I think about what I can learn from this book, it reminds me of the writer's technique in which when you're like planning your book, you first write one sentence outlining what the book is about. Then you write a paragraph outlining what the book is about. Then you write a page, and then you write 5 pages. It's basically starting from the very core of your novel and slowly kind of creating larger descriptions until you get a clearer idea of what your novel is about. Useful tactic. I use it sometimes I don't. It's all give and take. However, I will say that when I wrote my master's thesis, that tactic became very useful in reverse. So that after I had written my first draft of my master's thesis, I then condensed it into 5 pages, then condensed it into 1 page, then condensed it into a paragraph, then condensed it into a sentence. That sentence needed to be my research question ultimately. But that technique really helped me to create the final product of my thesis. And I think that's something that this book could have done with. Of course, I guess the synopsis was written after the writing of this book. However, it just felt like it kind of relays more to what the author originally had in mind as to what the book might have ended up being. So I feel like in the future when I'm writing, after a first draft, I really want to kind of consolidate that draft again into smaller chunks of blurbs, I guess, and then, really consider what is my book about? How am I achieving that? So in the second draft, I can write it in a way that is constantly propelling towards that overall aim, which is probably something that this book was lacking, I believe. The next book is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Of the 3 books I'm going to talk about, this is probably my favourite of the 3. It's an 800-page fantasy novel in which multiple characters are dealing with something that's going on in the world that they all inhabit, and there's sort of dragons that are coming to the forefront and bringing the end of the world. I guess that's the overall plot. I will admit, the last 300 pages, I think, of this, I kind of got through very quickly. It was very easy, very fast-paced and lots of action. This is an 800-page novel, which means the first 500 pages were really a hard slog, and it took me so long to finish this book. What I think is probably the weakest part of this book is that I think the ambition of the author doesn't match the skill of the author, and that's okay. I think, Samantha Shannon is still quite early on in her author career. As such, writing as a skill is something that develops over time and stuff. I feel like Samantha Shannon had an idea and was really excited about that idea and wanted to write it as soon as possible. But the execution of the idea within this story just doesn't feel well done. There are fantasy novels that kind of deal with very similar storylines and styles that have been condensed to 400 pages and, pack a much stronger story within that space. I think the reason I feel it might be a lack of skill is because it's supposed to be an adult fantasy, but it kind of at times feels quite immature and quite juvenile. And it really bothers me because it then feels like everything is happening at the hand of the author as opposed to at the hand of the characters directing the storyline. The idea feels forced, so therefore you can almost see the idea through the text, where I feel like as the book should present a storyline in which naturally encapsulates the idea as opposed to, thinly veiling the idea. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think the thing that I can learn most from this book is that writing is a skill that can be developed and that not every idea needs to be written immediately, because sometimes I think you have to acknowledge that you might not always be ready for the ideas that you have, and the ideas that you have can be written better at a later date. Not always the case, because I think, of course, you're going to have ideas which just are going to naturally come out of you and be the best that they can be at that time, but maybe passion isn't enough. Is that a really depressing thing to say? Oh, who knows? So then finally, the last book that I want to talk about is probably one of my more recent reads, a very disappointing read, and that's Motherhood by Sheila Heti. This is a fiction novel following a narrator who is debating what motherhood means. It's a semi-autobiographical novel, and if you just Google Sheila Heti, you can tell how much this is probably based on reality. So that's, I think, the thing that I want to focus on. Okay, I think for this one there's two things I want to focus on. First of all is this kind of being dressed up as a fiction novel, semi-autobiographical novel. I don't know, for me it felt a little bit deceptive because it just felt too much like it was the author writing her own opinion and experience and then dressing it up in a literary style to make it feel more fictional, in order to get out of being critical about her own opinion or her own work and stuff. To design this book as a fiction just felt like it was an easy path to not be challenged. I also kind of feel a little bit itchy when literary non-fiction can sometimes be confused with fiction, because something being literary doesn't necessarily make it fictional. Now, of course, that is just my opinion. The reason I feel so bristly about that, I think, is just because you don't know which part of it is fiction and which part of it isn't, and it blurs the line. And sometimes I think that blurring of the line can be a great way of challenging ideas, norms, concepts, and structures that we're used to in publishing. But I think it needs to be something that's very clear, and in this book, it wasn't clear at all to what extent is the narrator just the mouthpiece of the author, and to what extent is the things happening fictionalized events. Some people might like that, of course. It just makes me feel a little bit wary when going into the text. So that whole essence of kind of it feeling a little bit too much of a memoir as opposed to a fictional novel makes me feel like this book isn't written for anyone other than the author's own ego. This book has been very well received by some audiences, but I think it's a very narrow demographic of people that love this book, which excludes everybody else from being able to love this book, because this book is specifically designed for one particular demographic, and that's fair. I'm not meant to be that demographic. And I knew that going into the book, so I appreciate that my opinion is probably because this book wasn't specifically written for someone like me. However, the middle-class, cisgendered female experience narrows the perspective of this book so much so there were parts of it that I actually found quite offensive. The treatment of gay men in this book isn't necessarily good. There are problems with that. And I feel like because this book having such a narrow focus on an imagined reader, kind of feels like it's not doing its job as a book, because I feel like it's not allowing space for empathy for readers who don't align with the main identity of this author or this narrator. And I feel like should books be universal or not? This is a question. Art doesn't necessarily have to be universal. But books do also need to make money. They are a commodity. It's hard to appreciate this as a work of art when it does just feel like the author's opinion. Like, what's the difference between an opinion piece and a work of art? Of course, now we're getting to difficult philosophical questions, which I am in no way prepared to discuss at length here. But what I think I'm trying to say is that I feel like as a writer, if I want to write in the future, I may have a specific audience in mind, but I want to at least be able to create a perspective that can be appreciated outside of that demographic, so that many people can find a connection with the words. Not necessarily in a way that's universal, but in a way that's more open-minded. I think that's what I don't like about this book. It doesn't feel very open-minded at all, yet it's supposed to be extremely open-minded. I think that's... Yeah, the narrator, I think, positions herself as an extremely liberal, open-minded person, yet has created such a narrow-minded book. That might be my issue. And thank you for listening to my musings and being the sounding board that I can come to terms with that decision. So before I made this video, I was in the shower trying to think about, I'm going to try to create this objective learning experience of giving lowly rated reviews of books. I want it to be not heavily influenced by my emotions, and I want it to be something grounded and something I can learn from and everything. But I feel like I have actually just given you 3 very, very subjective opinions based on my emotions. So I'm going to leave you with that for you to ponder upon as I ponder upon myself. And maybe this exercise is harder than I thought it was going to be. So I shall bid you goodbye and hopefully come back with another video soon. Cheerio. Who says cheerio?